Should EU countries be able to set their own minimum wages? Denmark and Sweden say yes. But the European Court of Justice has dismissed their challenge to a mandate setting EU standards for adequate pay. So, does this reveal growing policy cherry-picking among some EU member states? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Denmark and Sweden have pushed back against the EU's attempt to shape minimum wage policy. They're among 5 EU countries without a statutory minimum wage. As the cost of living crisis drags on, governments across Europe are struggling to contain public discontent. But European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has hailed the landmark ruling as a milestone for Europeans and a win for dignity, fairness and financial security.
Denmark and Sweden don't want the EU dictating how much they pay their workers, taking the bloc to the European Court of Justice to challenge whether it should be enforcing a national minimum wage. They argued the EU was overreaching its powers, but the court thought differently, ruling an adequate minimum wage is valid. One part of the judgment did go in Denmark's favour. The court said the EU cannot directly set wages inside member states. Both Norway and Sweden use a collective bargaining system where unions and employers negotiate wages directly. Governments rarely step in. They're among 5 countries in the EU without a statutory minimum wage. Luxembourg has the highest, at just over $3,000 per month. Portugal sits in the middle with around $1,100, while Bulgaria has the lowest with $636. Across Europe, inflation has surged in the wake of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, pushing up the price of housing, energy and food, while wages lag behind. Even in countries with minimum wages, people say they are struggling. In France, thousands recently marched to demand higher pay.
When you earn the minimum wage, I think you're living hand to mouth. To protest is to lose a day's pay. I think most people are in favour of these demonstrations, but they can't afford to lose a day's earnings.
The EU mandate on minimum wages has been in place since 2022, but is yet to be implemented across the bloc. Europe's biggest trade union is urging all member states to finally enforce it. With this judgment, there appears to be no more excuses.
Well, first, let's go to Brussels and speak to Eva Hrncirova. She's the European Commission spokesperson on employment and social affairs. Eva, thanks for joining us on Roundtable. Ursula von der Leyen says this is a victory for dignity and fairness. I'm guessing you're in full agreement with her.
Absolutely. Good afternoon from Brussels. I have to confirm that Commission very much welcomes the judgment of the court.
And tell me, are you surprised that a country like Denmark wanted to block it and not implement the legislation?
No, we were not surprised, and we need to explain that it was not against the Commission proposal. It was more aimed at the co-legislators, because Commission is someone who puts the proposal on the table, while the European Parliament and Council, they adopt the decision, they adopted the directive. We fully understand the position of Denmark, which was later on joined by Sweden. And actually, the position of Denmark and Nordic countries, it brings an inspiration because they promote collective bargaining on wages, and they do it for decades, and they set a very good example. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that this exactly is in the directive, because our directive is much broader. What is important is that the court has said the directive is set on a legal ground. And we think it's important because it brings some social fairness, it brings inclusive economy, it supports purchasing power, it supports demand, it also can reduce inequalities, and it can also have an impact on the gender pay gap.
Eva, just tell me, there's still 5 countries out of the 27 EU countries who don't have a minimum wage. Do you think there'll be some pressure on them now to implement it? I'm talking about Finland, Italy, Austria, as well as the 2 nations you mentioned, Denmark and Sweden.
Yes, we see 19 countries from 27 that had actually already incorporated the directive into the national law. 3 have notified about partial incorporation, and 5 have not yet notified. But this is a normal process. It's a procedure that needs some time because the work is underway and it involves a lot of technical adjustments. It involves consultations with social partners, changes to wage setting frameworks. So it takes some time.
And just tell me, Eva, this legislation, it's 3 years old. I mean, some countries are clearly dragging their feet here.
Yes, but as I said, this is a normal process. Countries need some time. And because this is a directive, it's something where we just set up the direction. As you know, European legislation has different instruments, and directive basically sets the goal. So now the countries, they need to find their own way how to implement such a goal into their national system. We don't dictate them if to have a statutory minimum wage or a minimum wage that can be reached by bargaining. We just give a framework that is necessary to be transparent and that will set up the adequate minimum wage. This is what we ask them to do, and they need to integrate these provisions into their national system.
And Eva, final point to you. So it's clearly the European Commission's viewpoint that this legislation really strengthens workers' rights across the European Union.
Absolutely, absolutely. We think this is really a legislation that can improve the position of workers around Europe. And we have seen already since 2022, when the directive was adopted, that the minimum wages have risen rapidly across Europe, and it has obviously brought different standards of living, better standards of living for many workers. Because what is this directive is also about fairer wage settings. You can use some minimum wages as a reference value, because when you set the minimum wage, you obviously see what is the average wage, what is the median, and then according to this, you start to think about your minimum wage. And as a result of this, we also see that the gaps between the minimum wages and average wages has narrowed.
Eva Hrncirova from the European Commission, thanks for joining us. Well, joining us from Brussels is Valentina Ciami. She is Senior Programme Manager of the Social Europe and Wellbeing Programme, that's at the European Policy Centre. In Portugal, we have Ines Neves. She's Assistant Professor at the University of Porto's Faculty of Law. And in the Netherlands, we have Frans Pennings. Frans is Emeritus Professor of Labour Law and Social Security Law at Utrecht University. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Valentina, to you first of all, we've just heard from the European Commission saying that the whole point of this legislation is to create better standards for workers across the European Union. It's a noble idea, but it's clear with Denmark railing against it, some countries feel that they should be making their own legislation themselves.
Well, we consider at the European Policy Center that this was a landmark judgment for European citizens. It's really very good news that the European Court of Justice confirmed that this directive on adequate minimum wages is lawful. Why? Because in across Europe, minimum wages are set in a very, very different way. And there are two major problems. One problem is the adequacy, that in many countries they are really too low, even preventing people to escape from poverty. And the second major issue that this directive try to address is the coverage, because many workers or do not have collective agreements in sectors, so they are not protected, or anyway, there is no full coverage of minimum wages across Europe. So this directive, first of all, doesn't really impose any kind of harmonized minimum wage across Europe. It only tries to protect workers to benefit from adequate minimum wages, and it really empowers social partners, so both trade unions and employers, to work together and to basically improve the systems to guarantee people adequate minimum wages across Europe.
Let's bring in Ines. Ines, how significant a ruling is this from the legal perspective then? It's being described as a landmark ruling, as we heard Valentina say. Others have called it a milestone for the EU. Is it this big a deal?
Yeah, it is. But it actually leaves further questions open. To begin with, because there is a division between the Advocate General and the position of the European Court of Justice. And this has to do with the fact that in matters of social policy, there is an exclusion regarding pay. And there is a division of some doubts regarding what does this mean. In each circumstances, can the EU actually adopt legislation that might interfere with the level of pay or with some requirements regarding how payment is actually determined either by member states or by social partners? It is true that the directive it leaves further margin of appreciation both for member states and social partners. For instance, with regard to the criteria that must be taken into account in order to fix what is considered to be an adequate minimum wage, it only applies to member states where there is a statutory minimum wage. But even though this was considered invalid by the European Court of Justice, the reminder has been seen as in compliance with what the EU can legislate on, because there is a specific reference to legislation and in particular directives in the area of working conditions. And indeed, this is considered to be a provision or several provisions, two dimensions here, one regarding the adequacy of minimum wage and the other regarding the role and the need to increase the role and promote the role of social partners and collective bargaining. And in these areas, we might consider that we are in the domain of working conditions where the EU can legislate on.
Thanks, Ines. I want to bring in Frans. Frans, I just want to look at some of the wages across European Union countries. So it's all well and good having the legislation, but clearly some people are earning a lot more than others. If you look at the minimum wage, my home country, Ireland, minimum wage, €2,282 per month. But if you go to Bulgaria, it's just €551. If you look at Portugal, €1,015 is the monthly minimum wage. There's still a lot of discrepancy here.
Yeah, and that will remain to be the case, I expect. The purpose and the objective of the directive is just to have countries with a statutory minimum wage to introduce procedures to discuss the level of the adequacy of the minimum wages. So in all countries, it is now to be discussed whether the minimum wages are high enough given the cost of living, the cost of the rise of the wages, the purchasing power, the productivity. And these elements can still be different from country to country, but in all member states, these procedures have now to be followed, and also the social partners have to participate in these discussions.
Thank you, Frans. Valentina, I just want to look at the issue of cherry-picking policy. So the whole idea of the European Union is that all 27 member states are together, the policies are very much unified, and everyone sings from the same song sheet. It's clear that here we've got some countries who don't really like some policies and feel that they will implement the ones they do like and just kind of disregard the ones they don't. I mean, this cherry picking can't go on, can it?
Well, in social policies, the European Union has weak competencies compared to other areas. So this is not really the first time that we see that the member states don't like an initiative from, especially a legislative initiative from coming from Brussels. It is really not new. It has to do a bit like a sort of fear from member states about their own sovereignty in social policies, employment policies. And there is also fear by member states. Some member states consider that they have a very good, let's say, social systems. In this case, it's the systems that are used to set minimum wages that are very good, and they fear that an interference from the EU, the European Commission, might undermine basically the situation in their countries.
Thanks, Valentina. I want to come back to Ines. Ines, do you think it's a problem that this directive is now 3 years old and we've got countries waiting and seeing kind of that approach? Let's just see what others do. No one's in any rush to implement it. From a legal perspective, is that a problem?
Yeah, from a legal perspective, it is a problem because when a directive has a specific deadline to be transposed into national legislation, if that deadline is not complied with, member states might be in trouble. But in this specific case, bearing in mind that the Court of Justice has invalidated the two provisions or the two dimensions of the directive that, in my point of view, would have imply specific modifications or action or legislative action by member states, I believe that the remainder of the directive is already in most countries taken into account, either in constitutional provisions or in labor law. So it will be a matter of just specifying some details on the procedural norms that have to be complied with when fixing the adequate minimum wage, and of course ensure the action plan that is provided for with regard to the role of social partners and the importance of collective bargaining. In either case, I believe that in this specific context, since there was an action for annulment, and only now we have the Court of Justice ruling that specifies what is considered to be valid or not, I believe that the European Commission might exercise its margin of appreciation not to impose sanctions for not complying with the deadline for transposition.
Thanks, Ines. Frans, to you, talk to me about workers' rights then across the European Union. Are they getting stronger?
Yes, certainly. There have been a lot of important developments in the past period, like this directive on minimum wage, but there's also a directive on platform workers. There's a directive on predictable and transparent labor conditions. So the European Commission has presented a lot of proposals that have also been adopted at the end of the day. So we have seen important improvement of the workers' conditions also at the EU level in the past years. And of course, there has been now some delay with this judgment with the procedure of Denmark against the Parliament and the Council. But at the end of the day, I think that some blockades have been removed for further making social law, because there were still some doubts whether there was the possibility to make directives on wage and labor conditions. And I think that Denmark has, even though it didn't intend to do so, has cleared the way for further social legislation. So indeed, this is a landmark decision.
Thank you, Frans. Valentina, when will Italy bring in a minimum wage? Because of the 5 countries remaining, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Italy and Austria, just strikes me as odd that a country like Italy doesn't have a minimum wage set in stone.
In Italy, minimum wage is set not at a statutory level. It means that it is not set by law. It is set by collective bargaining. The current government is not really in favor of implementing this directive. But as now, I would say with this judgment, they will have to speed up the process. They are obliged to do so.
Thanks, Valentina. Ines, to you, I saw some quotes from the European Trade Unions Congress. They say this directive is solid, but it needs solid implementation. And they say workers need real pay rises and real bargaining power, not legal loopholes. So clearly the unions want the legislation to go even further.
Yeah, and I understand the position, because the directive, while of course is extremely important, and it is a proof of the evolution of the European Union from an economic project towards a more social one in the context of social market economy. The truth is that the directive leaves too much margin of appreciation, because it's the social policy matter, and in these matters the principle of conferral has its limitations. But the truth is that member states retain a great margin of appreciation to decide to establish the specific adequate minimum wage that they consider to be adequate, bearing in mind the procedure, and they are not even obliged to fulfill the 80% minimum of coverage or collective bargaining coverage that is provided for in the directive.
Thanks, Ines. Frans, how long until the European Union turns up the heat then on countries like Denmark and Finland and Sweden and says, you know, get on board with this?
Well, now the directive has not been annulled. It has to be implemented also in these Nordic countries. But they don't have to make a statutory minimum wage. They simply have to check whether everybody has access to the advantages in the collective labor agreements if there are minimum wages. So in fact, they don't have to do very much. The main issue of Denmark was that they were afraid that there could be any interference of the state in the collective labor agreements. But in fact, Denmark has already a good minimum wage in the collective labor agreements, and the same is for Sweden. So for them, it was more theoretical than practical. So I expect no problems with implementation in these countries.
Frans, were you surprised that a country like Denmark with a centre-left government would not want to bring in legislation that improves rights for workers? Strikes me as a bit strange.
Well, for Denmark, it's a matter of principle. So they want to have its labor relations just in their own hands, so of the social partners. They don't want to have any involvement of the state. And the reason is that the present model works quite well. There is a high organization level of the union members, and Denmark is afraid that if there's more state interference, that workers can say, okay, we can become free riders. We don't have to become union members anymore.
Thank you, Frans. Final point to you, Valentina. Just on that issue of poverty in the European Union, I mean, all of this legislation will ultimately start bringing all 27 countries to a level playing field. That's got to be the goal.
The most recent statistics provides that in 2024, 8% of the working force across the EU was at risk of poverty. Women are also those that are mostly affected because it's mainly women working in sectors that are regulated by minimum wages. We all know that there is already a gender pay gap, which of course translates into a gender pension gap. So the directive will also have with time a good impact on reducing pay and pension gaps. It will be good also for the economy itself because it will create a more level playing field and fair competition among businesses.
Valentina, thank you so much. And my thanks to Ines and Frans as well for their expert analysis. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.